Go ahead.
All right. So good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar, which is part of the Modernizing Infrastructure series that's sponsored by the Build America Center. I'm Mike Garvin. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech, one of the sort of the leaders or in the Build America Center, and it's my pleasure to be the host for this webinar. Very happy today to have Dr. Carter Casady with us. Dr. Casady has currently got a position working out at Stanford University, and his talk is about doing more with less, maintenance-oriented strategies for transportation improvements. And so, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carter. And I guess sort of a housekeeping note. If you have questions as he's presenting, feel free to type those into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and I will, if we get to a point where it makes sense to stop, to pose a question, I can do it at that point. Carter, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. And there might be one point I know where we might have a natural break for potential questions.
Sure.
We mention to something else. So no, I appreciate the invitation to give this webinar for the Build America Center. But unfortunately, you guys lucked out, and I'm talking about maintenance, which is not everybody's favorite subject, but I think is a really important topic that doesn't get a lot of attention. And so hopefully today, with some of the ideas that I present about, strategies for transportation improvements, we can think about better ways to maintain our infrastructure and do so in a more sophisticated and innovative way. So the first thing I'll start with is, this is probably one of the most overused examples and sources, but just the ASE reports continue to come out, monitoring the state of US infrastructure. And depending on what asset class you're looking at or asset category, they measure total needs, the actual funded obligations, and then what the funding gap is. And there tends to be a significant funding gap, usually in the billions, if not trillions of dollars. Surface transportation's in the trillions, for sure. I should note this was before the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but still, even with that legislation, there are still a number of funding gaps to be met and to actually improve the quality of our infrastructure around the country. And one of the most important things is that we often don't talk enough about deferred maintenance. This is one of the few resources that actually showcases how much we lag in terms of investment in our critical infrastructure, but the deferred maintenance liabilities at the state and local level are probably on the order of billions, if not trillions of dollars. And sometimes, simply knowing how much deferred maintenance exists is not likely to mean much to agency managers, elected officials, or the public. And I'll kind of go into why that's the case and talk about some of the reasons for why, we often defer maintenance and we don't think about maintenance as a priority, and we'd like to focus on other sorts of investment opportunities. But one of the important things about deferred maintenance is that we often find that maintenance becomes a salient issue once we start to see the consequences of deferral and the consequences of asset deterioration and those sorts of things. This next slide talks a little bit about what the consequences are of infrastructure failures. So there's been a number of different examples of assets that have failed in the US, whether it's Minnesota bridge collapse a number of years ago, or even sort of more recent events. We had a fire in Pennsylvania under an overpass that collapsed part of the overpass. So once critical infrastructure failures occur, that's when infrastructure maintenance and infrastructure becomes more salient. So we had Another issue, one recent example was just a number of years ago, there was this giant crack found in a Memphis bridge that was missed by inspectors, and it sort of indefinitely closed the bridge until they repaired it. It was a critical arterial um, that was really important for supply chains and vital for the local economy. So it was disrupting billions of dollars in economic activity and millions of I would say millions of dollars in economic activity every day. And this is again one example of when we have issues with infrastructure facilities and their current conditions. The salience and the consequences of the failures become pronounced, but we usually only think about them and talk about them once they hit the newspapers. Another recent example, unfortunately, the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed in Baltimore. This was not necessarily due to a deferred maintenance issue or to the actual, current condition of the bridge itself, but what this particular incident highlighted was, we were dealing with an aging asset in a critical port junction that could not withstand the impact of supersized container ships and how those container ships have grown in size over time. And so this is more of a resilience issue in the sense that, we often don't think about how we need to make sure our infrastructure is more resilient and think about new ways to improve it and modernize it and keep it up to date as our economies evolve and change. So this was a critical example of that the bridge was not resilient to an impact of this nature. And now it's all these aside from the tragedy of the loss of life, there was also many additional economic ramifications to the local economy, to the port, and so forth. So, like I said before, infrastructure tends to be invisible until it fails. It's not something we often take infrastructure for granted, and a lot of times, only when issues arise do we start to try and address them. And usually, being reactive in maintenance is much more costly. So one of the important things I want to stress is that it's really important to start to quantify how compounding deferred maintenance affects asset deterioration, performance, resilience, and overall life cycle costs. Because I think it would behoove public agencies not to start considering maintenance more strategically, because if you invest more upfront and spend a little bit more on maintenance preventatively, it can go a long way to mitigating the effects of deferrals and the escalating costs associated with them, which I often like to call the sort of hidden deficit, hidden infrastructure deficit that we often don't see. In terms of common explanations for deferred maintenance, some of this is related to inadequate public sector asset management proficiency. So what types of systems are in place to continue to monitor the quality of specific assets, whether that's transportation assets or any other type of infrastructure facility? Do we have sophisticated data management tools and software to try and understand what the real-time condition of assets are? I would say for a lot of public sector agencies, one, they don't have a lot of the data on the assets in which they manage, and two, they might also not know all the assets in which they manage. Another important implication for deferred maintenance is there just tends to be lack of public interest in maintenance. It's not a sexy topic. We don't like talking about it. We don't like thinking about it. It's not on the top of everybody's mind. Additionally, tends to be little political interest in maintenance. I'm still waiting for a politician to be elected for a maintenance strategy or to receive any political benefit from instituting robust maintenance policies. But a lot of the times the politics focuses on developing new infrastructure, ribbon cuttings, nice and shiny brand new facilities, rather than maintaining the rest of the infrastructure sought in a state of good repair. Additionally, maintenance also tends to be a low government priority at large. When there's a lot of ad hoc feature when there's a lot of ad hoc feature maintenance planning. And additionally, when there are constraints on the state budget or city budget, the first thing that tends to be cut is maintenance spending. And so in a lot of ways, maintenance tends to compete with other spending requirements. And when the budget gets tight, deferrals are sort of the first thing to follow. And then another important part is just political short-termism. So we, especially when it comes to election cycles and the here and the now, maintenance sort of takes a back seat when we're thinking about how to maintain a particular piece of infrastructure for the next 30, 50, 100 years. That's not going to be relevant to a lot of public agency managers at this particular point in time. They're probably not thinking 100 years down the line. Neither are the politicians as well. So they're probably thinking about their next fundraiser, their next election. So a 50-year maintenance plan is not high on the priority list. So what that tends to lead to is, we are systematically prone to spending far too little on normal civil infrastructure to actually maintain it in a state that would improve service quality, performance, and resilience, and all those other sorts of things that I mentioned previously. Additionally, there's another issue that sort of exacerbates the deferred maintenance problem, which is annual budget cycles. So there's an annual appropriation cycles for public agencies. They go to the Treasury legislature, they ask for amount of money for that specific year, that gets appropriated, then that money goes to public assets. But that's also in conjunction with sort of the cyclical industry component, which is in the first scenario, if you have an annual budget that's been appropriated and costs are lower than expected, what tends to happen is these agencies face a use it or lose it scenario. So you have extra money on hand rather than being able to carry it over to future budget cycles. You have to spend it all right now. If you don't, that may negatively impact your budget assessment for next year, because if you don't spend it all, then the Treasury legislature might give you less the following year. Because they determined, well, if you didn't use all your money this year, then you need less next year. That's not really how maintenance planning and strategic asset management works for things like infrastructure. Additionally, there's also scenario 2, which is costs are higher than expected, and that naturally leads to the underfunded agency dilemma. So what do you do when you don't have enough money to carry out all the work that you actually need to? Do you lay off people? Do you innovate to reduce your annual costs? Or, one of the natural conclusions is I just don't have enough money to do all these maintenance projects that I need to do in my portfolio. So I'm just going to have to put those projects off to the next year. And it might be the next year after that. And the can keeps getting kicked down the road, and the asset continues to deteriorate and not receive the proper care. So all these things, all these confluence of factors come together and affect the ability of public agencies and the like to effectively address their maintenance challenges. And this is why we sort of have a very large deferred maintenance burden. And so this is kind of the point where I could take some questions before I launch into some of my potential recommendations and strategies. But the question now is, like, how might we be able to address chronic deferred maintenance backlogs? And I'm going to walk through a number of steps that I think would make for an effective asset management strategy that public agencies could use to do that, to improve their transport assets. But I'll pause for a second and see if there's any questions.
So Carter, I haven't seen anything in the chat. If anybody has a question, feel free to post in the chat. Otherwise, I would say let's move on.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is the question, like, how do we address chronic deferred maintenance? There's not necessarily new funding coming around the bend. Again, the exception being the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided, it was a $1.2 trillion package. About half of that was going to be spent on maintenance priorities, but even so, that's a temporary stopgap solution. How do we think about sustainably managing our assets when we don't have federal intervention at the state and local level? So one of my recommendations is what I like to call adopting a fix-it-first approach to infrastructure lifecycle asset management, where you take a portfolio approach to all of the infrastructure in which your jurisdiction is responsible for, and think about this cyclical process of evaluating the needs and the construction of new facilities, the operations and maintenance of those, and then continue to evaluate those needs and then determine whether you need to enhance those assets, dispose of them, find new and innovative ways to realize value from them, and can you continue that process in a cyclical nature. So step number one, I would strongly encourage public agencies to develop an asset inventory. And this essentially means that you start documenting in real terms what infrastructure is actually under the control or purview of your organization or institution. I think people would be surprised to find that a lot of infrastructure owners aren't fully aware of exactly what assets they own or the extent of the responsibility they have for certain assets in their portfolio. So this could be a very uncomfortable exercise for certain public agencies, because it would sort of force them to lift up the rug or bring the skeletons out of the closet, so to speak, and start to really understand what their deferred maintenance liabilities are, how significant they are, and exactly what is under their purview of control. And doing this, knowing what's in your portfolio as a whole, and it's also its financial value, is going to be sort of one of the first critical steps in any portfolio construction approach to public infrastructure asset management. So you can get a handle on exactly, use a more data-informed approach to understand exactly what priorities should be at the top of the investment list when it comes to maintenance and renewals. So a good example of this is back in 2016, the New York City did an infrastructure audit, and they found that they had over 1,100 vacant lots that could be utilized for affordable housing. I think, if I remember correctly, the audit said that they could possibly build 57,000 affordable housing units in these spaces. So this is just kind of one example of a city doing its own infrastructure audit and realizing that it had a lot more assets at its disposal than it realized. And for anybody who knows how expansive land is in the New York City area, we're talking, billions, if not trillions of dollars in collective value. So, this was a very valuable exercise for them in the sense that they unearthed a number of strategic properties and locations and lots that could be utilized for future development. And all that was just the byproduct of doing an audit and trying to understand exactly what was in their inventory. So this is, again, step number one: developing an asset inventory is critical. All right, step number two, I would say, is assessing the market value of the inventoried assets. So some of the data points that might be important to collect when inventorying assets, so you could create unique identifiers for the specific assets in question, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a tunnel, whether it's a highway, that type of thing. Give it identifiers, asset types, kind of like I just said, so that you're documenting all the individual pieces of the network. And this I'm specifically relating to transport infrastructure, but this is could generally apply to other asset types as well and other sectors. Additionally, you might want location data, characteristics, what's the size of the facility, ownership, year of construction, those types of things. And then thinking about trying to get valuation data. So what might be the net book value and the current replacement value of that particular piece of infrastructure? Is it a vital bridge? What would it cost to replace that bridge? Right? What is its current value now? Other things to consider, like condition. What's the age of the facility? What's the facility's condition? How large is the deferred maintenance liability for that facility? Other things might be, what are the management responsibilities for that particular asset? Like, who's responsible for operations and maintenance and capital renewal? Trying to document all these things in one central repository could be very helpful. And again, additionally, who's going to manage and maintain the ongoing costs, and what is the relationship to the government's program uses? Like what asset categorization might this fall into? Is this a core asset for the government? Is it sort of a transitional asset that, the government might think about, doing something differently with? Or, is it an asset that could be repurposed in some way, shape, or form? So these are some of the things that could go into an asset inventory, right? And, in terms of getting market valuing, inventoried assets, one of the recommendations would be, enlist the help of experts in infrastructure appraisal and valuation. So there's actually a notice of funding opportunity right now from the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's called the Innovative Finance and Asset Concession Grants Program. And part of this funding right now is available for state and local governments to go out there and procure the services of technical experts to help them understand their assets and try and determine what is the value of their current assets and how they might be, better utilized. So this is actually a real thing that's happening right now, and I think it's a program that a lot of state and localities should take advantage of if they want to, use additional funding that's being provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to, help develop this sort of capacity to understand the true value of the assets in which they manage. And getting this market assessment is going to be really important because it'll help owners decision when it comes to the proper management of the portfolio. And understanding the true value of all the assets under management is really helpful, so you can make strategic decisions about the proper operation and maintenance of those assets. What gets the highest priority? Well, if I don't have any data on these specific facilities in my portfolio, how do I know what are the highest priority components of my network that I must be taking care of? So having that portfolio perspective and those value considerations are very helpful in terms of making strategic decisions. All right. Step number 3, optimize infrastructure asset utilization. So you might use, this is called, the VFA is like an asset management software. That's the thing on the right. And essentially, there's a number of different off-the-shelf asset management packages and softwares that could be utilized to capture a lot of this data and help public agencies manage it and understand not only the market value of their assets, but also the extent of their inventory assets, and start to do some sort of fresh, thorough analysis of the best way to utilize those assets under a jurisdiction's control. So what does that mean? That means, starting to think about things like, do we look for specific, transferred access? Do we look at doing long-term leases, PPP, public-private partnership-based agreements, where we enter into concessions with private firms to generate capital from the value that we now know those assets provide, right? Do we do that? Is that a strategy that we should pursue? Do we explore certain asset sales? Is that an option for specific facilities? What about short-term leases and concessions? And in-kind asset transfer. So this is an interesting concept. Can we transfer the responsibility of a revenue generating asset to maybe a government pension fund so that we can help, so that revenue generation from the infrastructure helps, manage the long-term liabilities of pensioners and supports the returns that we need in the pension system to pay the folks their benefits. That's actually been done in Australia. with a toll road system. And so, you know, these aren't out of the blue recommendations. These are things that actually are done around the world. And then also, you know, should we explore value capture strategies if we in and around the infrastructure, you know, thinking about develop it around transportation and infrastructure assets, and how do we capture value from investments in those areas? So all these things could come into play, but really you have to first understand the extent of your portfolio and the value of your portfolio before you can start making strategic decisions about specific assets within the portfolio. If you don't have that information, you're flying blind. And then there's also the case where sometimes it may just be the best option maybe to do nothing. Might imply that, you know, things are being managed effectively as they currently are, and that's an okay option too, right? So, but all the steps in this process will hopefully allow public agencies to make a more informed decision about their infrastructure asset utilization. And so the last step is think about asset monetization and reinvestment. This is sort of completing the loop, if you will. So what does that mean? You know, okay, you've done a fresh and thorough analysis of your portfolio. You've looked at the value proposition of specific assets. Maybe you want to engage in some asset concessions and leases and that sort of thing. Start to execute those key operational and managerial changes, start to realize the value from those transactions, and then and then be careful with the proceeds that have just been generated and think about, again, the fix it first approach. Reinvest in new assets, reinvest in the existing assets, in the rest of the system, right? You know, use the generated value from some of these strategies to put it back into the system and to continue to generate more value, to improve service quality, to improve resilience, to improve performance, right? So this is a particularly interesting step in this process because one, it can offer a viable catch-up funding mechanism. So what that means is, you know, especially in a day and age where public agencies can often be constrained in terms of their budgets, taxes don't increase, we don't have enough user fees to bring in enough funding to actually deal with all of these deferred maintenance issues. But one thing we can recognize is that there's substantial latent value embedded in the infrastructure that already exists in the US. And that value has accumulated over decades. So public agencies have an opportunity to release that latent value, capitalize on it, and use it as a mechanism to help further improve the networks in which they operate. So in a way, if you follow this process, it's designed to incentivize jurisdiction to recycle capital from mature assets into new productive investments. And like I said before, ideally, you want to make those new productive investments, you know, start addressing more of that maintenance backlog, start improving other elements of the transportation network, and so forth, right? Use that capital that you've realized from mature public assets to improve the value of your other assets, right? So that's sort of the 4 steps. I'm gonna go into a quick example of how that actually played out in practice in the US, but I'll stop briefly if there's any specific questions. I see one in the chat. Should I take one now?
The question is in the chat is, I guess, providing a little bit more evidence of the status quo for, you know, infrastructure, the condition of infrastructure in the United States. I think you started presentation talking a bit about, you know, I guess where ASC sees things standing in that respect. So I think maybe the example you're going to give might address the question. So
okay,
let's maybe move forward, and then we could come back to it too.
Yeah. Well, I would say, yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, it's not to say that public agencies don't have some rough understanding of things that they're responsible for in their portfolio. It's just that this is a lot of the strategy for asset management is not done systematically in a data informed way, which could be quite advantageous in terms of making better strategic decisions with even limited funding that you do have, right? So, I mean, just talking with a number of public agencies recently, in some of the P3 certification training program that AIAI is running, a lot of those public agencies are just trying to get a grip on exactly what they can do with specific projects that they're currently working on right now. And it's clear they don't have a full grasp of exactly the strategies or approaches that they should be taking and how their specific projects fit into an overall into an overall maintenance strategy and an investment strategy. That's not to say there aren't, 10-year transportation infrastructure plans and other sorts of planning documents out there that are helping public agencies try and manage their investments over the long term. It's just that when it comes to maintenance, this tends to be overlooked. But yeah, I'll go into an example right now, which I think will be very illuminating. So the example I'm going to talk about is the Indiana Toll Road. A lot of you may or may not be familiar with this project, but there was a concession. The initial concession for the Indiana Toll Road was back in 2005. So Indiana leased the ITR to a concessionaire and received an upfront payment of about $3.85 billion. And that was for a 75-year concession at the time to operate and, basically collect the tolls generated from the system, because that was a valuable asset in the transportation system of Indiana. And at the time, I believe, the system was actually losing money. It wasn't collecting enough tolls to manage its own maintenance. So this was sort of a strategic play for Indiana to try and realize some of the value from the system and get private sector folks involved to do things like, they implemented electronic tolling. So that lowered the transaction costs and improved toll collection rates, right? They also invested in upgrading and widening sections of the toll road. And additionally, the part of the contractual arrangement was you need to maintain specified service levels in designated rural and urban areas. So, all sounds well and good, right? But the critical thing that Indiana did in this particular case, and one caveat I should make is this was in the lead up to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So this was actually a really good deal for Indiana because the concessionaire who gave up $3.85 billion to the state for this project actually ended up going bankrupt because of some financial instruments that they had set up, interest rate swaps ahead of the financial crisis. And that put them in that really exacerbated their debt, and they ended up going into bankruptcy. And the projects kept operating the entire time, but the concessionaire had to be bought out, and the project got restructured, and a new concessionaire came in and took over. But the state of Indiana was insulated from all of that potential risk, and they walked away with $3.85 billion back in 2005 when they started this concession. So what did they do with that money? Well, they were very smart. The Indiana Department of Transportation took the proceeds and they decided to use that upfront concession payment to leverage an additional $10.8 billion in investment in their 10-year surface transportation plan. So they took the latent value that was in that particular asset and reinvested it in their system to do things like building almost 500 miles of new highway, rehabilitating and replacing 6,400 miles of highway, constructing 60 new or reconstructing interchanges, right? And they also rehabilitated 1,400 rehabilitated or replaced 1,400 bridges, which at the time was about 25% of the state's inventory. I mean, if you just take a step back, think about how impactful it is. It's from one concession, right, that they were losing money on, and they didn't have the proper means at the time to figure out how to that they weren't in a position to raise tolls or do all these things that the private sector did to improve the operations of the Indiana toll road. They took the value from that concession and improved the entire transportation system, right? So they invested back in the system with substantial results. And so that's a very clear indication of the value of how, the realized capital from asset monetization could be put to good use to improve other areas of the system without having to go raise taxes, without having to go levy new user fees and so forth. And we can expect that from those improvements, there might be other areas of the system, again, if you're taking a portfolio view, that could then be further monetized and then use those proceeds again to be reinvested back into the system, right? So there's tremendous opportunity there. So I'll continue. Other interesting elements of the Indiana Toll Road. In a report by Bob Poole notes that the deal also allowed them to repay $200 million in ITR debt, and they also invested $500 million in a next generation trust fund. I'll talk about more about this later, but this is a really interesting concept. You take the capital from these asset monetizations and you preserve it. You put it in a trust fund. It's now designed to generate stable long-term maintenance funding for the transportation network. You've taken value out of the system. Now you're putting it in a place that then can grow and accumulate capital to create a sustainable source to fund long-term maintenance spending. That's a great example. Additionally, again, this was as of April 2011, but the fund generated $755 million in an interest income. So you've taken the value from the asset, you put it in a fund. That fund's now generating more money for the state, not only to be used in just for maintenance funding, but it's this once revenue losing asset is now funding billions of dollars in transportation investment, and generating hundreds of millions of dollars for the state, for its long-term transportation needs. So I mean, Indiana came out as a huge winner from just this one project, right? And I think there's a lot of other opportunities out there for different public agencies to think about, like, how can we be strategic with certain asset monetizations to generate capital that we can preserve and help us continue to invest and grow and maintain our system in a sustainable way. So more on this innovative point about the benefits of establishing a permanent fund. So if we're talking about a fix-it-first approach, the proceeds from asset monetization can be directed to address critical deferred maintenance problems. We've now realized capital, and we can start to deploy that strategically to start whittling away at the backlog of deferred maintenance. And if we're smart about it, and we put it in a permanent fund, right, which is just a specific type of public trust fund, we can preserve that capital. And so this is not a uncommon thing. There's a lot of permanent funds out there. Alaska has one, Texas, Norway, Canada, a lot of other parts of the world use permanent funds, and they do that to preserve natural resource wealth. So there's been a lot of governments out there who have said, hey, wait a minute, we shouldn't be frivolous in spending all this money that we've generated from natural resource wealth. We should preserve it. We should invest it. We should make more money, and we can use that in a sustainable way to help us meet other spending priorities. This is just another way to think about it, in the sense that you're capturing infrastructure wealth, latent infrastructure wealth, so to speak, and you're preserving it from asset sales, and you're depositing it in a public trust that now can invest in future transportation infrastructure in a sustainable way. And if it's sophisticatedly managed, that fund may not ever be exhausted. And if it's sophisticatedly invested as well, can generate substantial income for the state. So again, the benefits is one is by putting this money away from asset monetizations, you also insulate it from general budget and political spending pressures, right? So this money's protected. It's for the infrastructure system. It's for investing in the transportation network, right? And then additionally, like I said before, these newly funds can generate investment income. And that investment income can be devoted to supporting future transportation infrastructure investment, right? So you can, use the capital on hand to generate more capital to create a sustainable model so that, we can really tackle deferred maintenance challenges head on. So that's all I have to say about just the permanent fund. I only have like one or two more slides, but I'm gonna pivot quickly to another interesting strategy that could be sort of rolled into all of this, and that is called project bundling. So the example I always like to give, it's the most notable in the US in the transportation arena, is the Pennsylvania Rapid Bridge Replacement Public-Private Partnership Agreement. And so we can also think about doing projects a little bit more innovatively, right? One of the ways to do that, and so this was, in this case, the Rapid Bridge Replacement Project happened to be one of the largest roadway projects in Pennsylvania's history. It's sort of a $1.1 billion deal. But what was unique about it was the agreement was set up so that instead of having to go individually address structurally deficient bridges throughout the state, the project packaged 558 structurally deficient bridges into one contract. And so those are now going to be replaced under one agreement, with one provider, and done in a way that saves a lot of cost, because all the transaction costs associated with having to run procurements for all those individual projects go away. This was unique in the US because it was sort of the first of the kind to bundle all these different individual projects into one package under a public-private partnership agreement. And I will say this is not, while this was sort of relatively novel for the US experience, this is not an uncommon thing practiced in other jurisdictions internationally. We see this a lot with the deployment of new schools. A lot of project agreements will bundle the delivery of 5, 10, 15, 20 schools into one infrastructure contract. That way you reduce costs and accelerate their delivery of the infrastructure and their replacement or their new development, whatever it may be. In this case, it was, hoping to reduce costs and accelerate the replacement of the bridges, again, using other innovations like prefabrication, mass production, and all other things related, and standardization, all those things that could be incorporated and benefit from having this bundled into one specific agreement. And so far, I haven't seen any other public-private partnership project in the country that has embarked on such a multi-asset, multi-location undertaking of this nature. But this can be another part of the maintenance strategy. So we've realized new capital, we put it in a permanent fund, we're thinking strategically about how to invest that. Let's think about bundling projects together to do more with less and to do it more quickly, and to get more projects done so we can address more issues faster. This, again, I think this is a often underutilized and underthought of topic. So again, when you couple these things together, they can be really powerful approaches to improve infrastructure asset management. So I'm just gonna conclude with a few short comments, and then I'll leave a few minutes for questions. But like I said before, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has done a great deal to provide additional funding to a lot of state and local governments to help address their infrastructure needs. By some estimates, the underfunded maintenance liabilities exceed $1 trillion. Well, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was about 1.2 trillion, but half of that was going to maintenance, half of that was going to new construction and other things like technical assistance and the notice of funding opportunity that I referenced earlier. So, clearly we're not in a position to fully close those infrastructure gaps, right? The latest round of federal funding was still not going to be enough. And, it's for the time being, it's not something that we can continue to bank on. There's no guarantee that there's going to be a reauthorization. There's no guarantee that the money will continue to flow. So, it's state and local governments have to think about what strategies can they employ to more effectively and sustainably manage their infrastructure portfolios. And so my recommendation is, again, if you think about a fix-it-first approach, like I've described here, it does do exactly, it allows public agencies to do more with less. Again, you don't need to raise taxes, you don't need to institute new user fees, but you're just using the value of your portfolio at hand to invest in other areas of the portfolio. So monetizing underutilized assets to help fund infrastructure maintenance, using these strategies to relieve pressure on state budgets, creating a permanent fund so that you can preserve that capital and grow it over the long term in a sustainable way. And then, as some of the examples have illustrated, actually transferring some of those operations and maintenance costs and risks to private firms where they might be better managed. They might not always be better managed in that case, and that's all part of the strategic decision making that goes into this. It's going to come down to an asset by asset consideration. Do we monetize this asset? Do we keep this asset under government control? All that is only really possible when you have the full picture of the portfolio and that's true and have sort of measured its value and then can have sort of a data informed approach to actually tackle these sorts of questions. And so I'll end by saying, all of this really starts with organizations, they got to know what assets that they own and manage, locations, conditions, management responsibilities, ongoing costs, and the relationship to the overall programmatic objectives of the government. So that's all easier said than done, right? But those are sort of the critical criteria as part of the steps in the asset management approach that I just outlined. And so I think if we can move in that direction and get a little bit more sophisticated about our maintenance strategies, we'll do the country a great service and start to address a lot of these deferred maintenance liabilities, improve the quality of our infrastructure, improve the resilience of our infrastructure, improve the performance, and hopefully do that in a sustainable way for the long term. So yeah, that's all I have for now. There's about 10 minutes left, so if anybody has any questions, happy to take them. But yeah, that's all I got, Mike.
Well, thanks, Carter. So as Carter mentioned, I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. I did. So Federal Highway has published a guidebook about bridge bundling. So I posted a link to that in the chat. For folks that may or may not be aware of that particular publication, which talks about the potential of doing rehabilitation and replacement, using a bundling approach.
Yeah, that's a great resource. And the other thing I would say, is everything I've presented today is sort of not pie in the sky, abstract and totally out of the blue, right? All of this material that I presented today is in reference to actual practices that sophisticated public agencies use, right? And I would say just in kind of looking around internationally, some of the places where I see this most effectively implemented is in Canada. There's a lot of very sophisticated provinces that have specialized organizations with really robust capital planning programs. And they're doing all of these steps that I just described. They're doing all of this in a very data-informed way, in an even much more detailed way than I've led on to in this particular presentation, where they're actually going down to the asset component level, measuring the value of individual asset components and their individual replacement value and the remaining useful life on all those individual components, and aggregating that up into a replacement value for the asset, and doing routine conditions assessments, and putting all this information into a data repository, so then they can make sometimes tough decisions even in cases where they're still underfunded. They might have to defer projects, but they now have a data informed strategy to say, hey, you know what, like we have some really priority investments that we need to make, and this project can get deferred because we know its condition, we know we can extend its useful life. That can wait. We know that.
Carter, it's Mark Orge up in Toronto. Great presentation, by the way, and you're absolutely preaching to the converted when it comes to deferred maintenance. I presented at a few conferences around the crumbling infrastructure that whether it's federal or provincial or state government, we're all seeing it around us. My firm and my group, particularly with Altus, I have a colleague in the US that I work closely with. We're engaged in many, like multiple P3 projects across North America and beyond. We just completed due diligence for the monetization of the toll highways in Puerto Rico. No, it's really refreshing to hear the discussion around the value of P3. There's no system that's the end all and be all. And thank you for pointing out Canada. I mean, we're not perfect. The intelligence really started in the UK. That's why most of the people around me in my office have a different accent because that's where the skills have come from. But no, we've Suffolk County, LAX. We're just starting Suffolk County. We're just halfway through Garden Grove Police Department. It really can apply, and the way that I sell it and explain it to people is that politically, where I see the success is you hit the nail on the head. No one is going to win an election saying, hey, I'm going to go into debt by $100 million. But they definitely can do well saying, I'm going to build 3 hospitals this year or in the next 10 years. And P3 101 for anyone on the call that would like just the 2-sentence explanation is, most of us in this day and age anyway can't go and buy a house cash. We sign a mortgage. A P3 is where you sign up to a mortgage, but it comes with 30 years of repairs, guaranteed life cycle, not deferred. And the risk is transferred to Johnson Controls, Honeywell, NG, one of the big organizations that can assume that risk. And, if they mess up a bid, and myself and my team have worked for all those firms in our history before we came into P3 Consulting. Everyone has a site where, miss this or miss that. But in the aggregate, even if they completely screwed up a bid, there are bonds, there are recovery tools, there's protection for the taxpayers and the citizens. So again, I don't want to sound like the P3 messiah, but it does solve, especially when it comes to deferred maintenance. You've got a payment schedule that gives you this much funding on this year and this year and this year. And when you mention joint technical reviews, that's one of the things we do. We do life cycle audits, technical reviews all across North America. And you know what? I'll tell you this. We issue these reports. They're a lot of work. They're weeks of work. But when we go to these sites, we don't have findings. We issue the letters as an independent third party that says, yes, it's being run well. You know what? You shouldn't be storing that desk in the mechanical room. It's a combustible material. Okay, get it out. These sites are 95% very well run. They're up to date. If they've deferred capital, it's because they invested it elsewhere and they've done a great job maintaining that chiller or boiler, and it's good for another 5 years. Anyway, sorry, that's my soapbox for today.
No, I mean, I think all those observations are really pertinent. And it's interesting you brought up the UK because just with some of the research being done over there and things I know, sure they may have a little bit more sophistication in terms of thinking about this, but they have a ton of deferred maintenance liabilities, especially in their transportation network.
We
And
all do.
and some of the things that I've heard from folks on that side of the pond is that, you know, especially when in their local roads sector, when they were, when those deferred maintenance issues were accumulating and the conditions of their local roads were deteriorating, and they continue to issue these negative reports.
Yeah.
Instead of actually devoting the capital to fix them, what they did instead was they just stopped doing the reports. They just stopped measuring how bad the problem was. And that's why I think that there is really this hidden deficit is in a lot of jurisdictions, in a lot of places, not just in the US, but globally, we're just not measuring the problem enough. And it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. If we don't have any way to measure it, we don't really know truly how bad the situation is. And so we kind of just like to stick our head in the sand and keep moving forward. But, you know, and I'm not going to ever say that P3s are the solution to all these problems, nor is that the recommended approach in all instances. But what I will say is that we can start to get a little bit more sophisticated about how we think about our assets from a portfolio perspective, and then start to make more strategic decisions and implement innovative tools that already exist. It's like we're not having to like reinvent things, or we're not kind of having to invent things here. Like a lot of the stuff presented is already out there. A lot of the stuff has already been tried and done. Just a matter of adopting these more innovative approaches and thinking about how we can use them collectively and strategically to better manage our assets.
Well, and it's versatile. I mean, and P3 isn't just one avenue. There are different P3 models. There's Alliance, Progressive, there's DBB, Design Build Buy, there's Design Build. Of course, most of us agree that some form of design build, finance, operate and maintain, DBFOM is good, because that maintenance component is what will, you know, avoid the deferred capital, etc. But there's some really interesting things going on out there. We were involved at the early stages with Potrero Bus Yard in San Francisco, which is neat. It's a transit facility, but it's also mixed with retail and shopping, and then condominiums up above. The architects and designers that got with the city were really innovative in combining, taking a chunk of real estate and looking at all these different needs and saying, well, let's just combine all the needs and let's build one great big facility that solves it all. You live there, you shop there, you go downstairs, get on the bus or the train, and off you go.
Right. And the only thing I'll add to that is, that kind of speaks to the point of thinking about innovative value capture strategies around transit-oriented development. Like, how can you realize potential value from, you know, peripheral real estate development and other sorts of elements that go in and around the transportation network, and how you think about capturing that value and then thinking about, you know, strategically managing it. Before, I know we're now at the top of the hour, but is there anybody else that has questions? Because I wanted to open the floor and see if there's any.
Yeah, sorry to hog that. Just one thing, if you want any sample reports, I've got actual reports that I'm happy to share if it's of value, Carter. You can find me.
You just message me offline and we'll have.
Yeah.
But yeah, anybody else have any other questions about what was presented or otherwise?
I
think we're going to wrap it up now. So.
All right. Well, so we will wrap up. So I want to thank Carter for joining us today, giving us the presentation. You know, again, kind of thinking a little bit more broadly about how you might approach maintenance strategies, and you know, I think there are quite a number of examples, you know, of using, you know, these kind of value capture techniques, you know, asset monetization and whatnot to take, you know, to pull some of that, you know, some of that value out of existing assets and redeploy it in productive ways. And so with that, I think, you know, if you do have anything that you want to follow up with, you're welcome to email me or email Carter. You know, my email is garvin@vt.edu. That's victortango.edu. And I think Carter,
Yeah, mine's
was on.
CB and then Casady, my last name, Casady @stanford.edu.
Is it
So
CTB?
CB, C cat, B as in boy, and then last name. Oh, you can also just message me on LinkedIn. I will usually respond.
Just
So,
type your email into the
So
chat.
Mike, somebody asked the question about whether the slide deck would be available. And we're actually recording this, so we will post that online. But I don't know, we can also post a slide deck if Carter, if you're willing to share it, but you'd have to send it to me.
yeah, I'll send it to you. That's fine.
Okay, all right, we'll post them up.
Great. All right. Thanks everybody for being here today, and happy Friday, and hope you have a good weekend.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.